Let's begin. Reading the updated new edition of Tim's book, The Conservative Party After Brexit, is a wild ride with one crisis or scandal after another. 14 years, 5 elections, 5 prime ministers, and a whole lot of mess. How did it all go so horribly wrong? Was Brexit the culprit or something even more profound? So, Tim, how was the first edition received by Conservatives?
It's always difficult to know exactly what they think. Most people are fairly polite. I don't think I've lost any friends because of it. And certainly, as someone who also is involved in writing the kind of Nuffield study of the general election with Rob Ford and Will Jennings and Paula Surridge, I've had to do some interviews with Conservatives, and it doesn't seem to me to be the case that they've turned me down as a result of anything I've written.
That's good. So they go, oh, God, not you. So there we go.
I mean, it's not like you were telling them anything that they didn't already know about the disintegration of their party. It's not like they hadn't noticed, right?
Well, I mean, we will get to that. Some seem not to have. They've had so many leaders with, as this book reminds me, often very inconsistent agendas. When telling the whole story like this, what became clearer to you about, I mean, is there a sort of overall arc, or is it just these kind of like 5 stories wedged together?
No, I mean, I think it is difficult when you are writing what is essentially a kind of chronological account, not to make it one damn thing after another. And I think there is a red thread or a blue thread running through it. And that is really the transformation, which I talk about in the title, of what was, I think, a mainstream, fairly centrist Conservative Party, at least in relative terms, into what I would now say is a kind of ersatz populist radical right party. And that being driven, I think, out of fear mainly about being replaced or at least challenged in a significant way by Nigel Farage's various vehicles. And I think what many Conservatives, unfortunately, have done is take what they regard as the kind of intuitive route out of that problem, which is to be more like that party in the hope that, as a result, voters will stick with them rather than fleeing to the more radical option. But that, I think, has resulted, as I say, in the party's centre of gravity shifting very, very far to the populist right. In such a way as perhaps it's too late to get it back, but we'll see.
Well, that, I think in 2017, that only 4% of members backed no deal. 2 years later, 56% said they would rather see their party destroyed than lose Brexit, and perhaps indeed are getting their wish. And then more than half backed Trump in 2020 in a Conservative home poll. So is this being driven by radicalised members?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think there is, if you like, a feedback loop or interaction between, on the one hand, Conservative Party MPs and on the other hand, the grassroots. I think certainly social media has played a part in this to the extent that it is now possible, I think, for MPs, particularly if they're clever users of social media, to become, if you like, kind of legends in their own lunchtime very, very quickly, and to become stars as far as many of the grassroots are concerned. And I think that has disrupted the hierarchy on which the Conservative Party always to some extent relied for its integrity and its organisation. So I think there is an extent to which, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg would be an example, but Boris Johnson is perhaps the greatest example. There's an extent to which they have, moved the grassroots in that kind of populist radical right direction. And then, of course, the fact that the grassroots have moved in that direction means that people who, are trying to get selected as MPs, for example, people who are trying to move up the ranks want to appeal to those people. And to some extent, I mean, you mentioned Conservative Home. I think that league table, be interesting to hear what the rest of you think about that, actually has made a difference as well. I think, it is the case that MPs who are wanting to get ahead want to be seen to be doing well in that particular table. And in order to do that, I think they have to make comments which please Con Home readers. Now, I'm not saying Con Home readers are totally unrepresentative of Conservative Party members, but I think, they do tend towards the right, as it were, of the membership, perhaps more than towards the centre or the left.
Rachel, do you think those league tables have made a big difference?
I certainly think that Conservative MPs pay a lot of attention to those tables, and things like Kemi Badenoch being top of the table for a really long time and the favourite to take over from Rishi Sunak, and then how quickly her ranking has fallen since actually becoming leader. Like, that kind of stuff does get talked about. I think there's also a difference. I know you're talking about Conservative members here, but there is a difference between Conservative members and Conservative voters. And that difference is really marked when you have a site specifically for the membership. It kind of gives the party a inward-looking channel, as it were. Also, just Tim's point about social media being a real factor in MPs wanting to build profiles. I think that's absolutely the case. The prime example for that, for me, is Lee Anderson, who made a couple of really ill-judged, sort of blatantly stupid comments about food banks, 30p Lee, etc., got a whole lot of social media attention for it, ended up interviewed on GB News and other places, built a following, and the Conservative Party leadership was so worried. He was a backbench MP who was not expected really to keep his seat, who had also been a Labour councillor previously, but they were so worried about that they went and made him vice chair of the party. And it was very obvious that he would be a liability for the leadership because he was going to carry on saying things, and then the leadership would constantly be asked, do you agree with this thing that Lee Anderson has said? And they put him in the position where they were vulnerable to that, and enabled him to build a platform that meant when he got suspended and then went to reform, it was a huge story. Wouldn't have been that if they just let him be.
Well, let's look at the mainstream media. The right-wing press, pushed for the hardest Brexit, celebrated Truss and Kwarteng's mini-budget. Thought that was a brilliant idea. How responsible are the papers for the Tories' radicalisation, for just sort of goading them on?
I think we've talked on this podcast before about how the echo chamber that is particularly the Telegraph has not really been very helpful to the Tories in terms of their electability, because it keeps pushing them further and further right and away from where the average voter is. I think it'd be really, really interesting thinking about why we don't have an equivalent on the left, because if we did, then there'd be a bit of challenge and it would be less of an issue that politics was being driven in that way. But we've certainly seen how a kind of very niche, one-off tweet gets seized upon by the Telegraph, and then there's a flurry of attention over it, and then it's on GB News, and then because it's in the media, ministers are asked about it, and then it's on the BBC because their comments become a story. And that trend, that ecosystem, that keeps happening. And I don't think any politician has figured out how to break that cycle and just go, I'm not going to engage with this. It was a tweet.
Yeah, can I just say, I think that's right. And I think what Paul Goodman, who used to edit Con Home and is now in the House of Lords for the Conservatives, calls the right-wing entertainment complex, is, very much part of the story that in some senses the book tells. I would argue and have argued for some time that actually you have to see the right-wing newspapers, the people who write those op-eds, the editors, the proprietors, as an integral part of the Conservative Party. I call them the party in the media, because the influence that they exercise over MPs and over the leadership of the party is, I would say, disproportionate. And I think, as Rachel said, actually quite problematic for the party, because it gives them an impression of public opinion which is completely and utterly skewed. And as those papers have moved even further to the right, and the Telegraph is the prime example. I mean, the Mail has always been there, and the Express to some extent has always been there. But anyone who read the Telegraph 10, 15, 20 years ago would have been used to it being a fairly staid, traditional Tory newspaper. I mean, anyone who looks at the headlines now, particularly obviously as they're kind of pumped on social media, will know that they are totally hyperbolic. Out of any objective view, they would be seen as very much a kind of reform-friendly, GB News-friendly site.
There's there's a lot of prime ministers to get through. Theresa May was a Remainer, backed by Remainers, who you report cried when Leave won. And after leaving office, she became a relatively moderate voice, often criticising the government from the left. Yet she became a divisive populist, notorious for phrases. I mean, this brings back memories. Citizens of nowhere. No deal is better than a bad deal. Brexit means Brexit. Philip Hammond says in your book, I'm not even sure she understood how extreme the words coming out of her mouth really were.
Yeah.
What happened to her?
Well, I mean, she was in an unenviable position. I think she, as Home Secretary, very much understood the referendum through the lens of immigration, actually. So, given that that was the case, it meant that our departure from the single market was almost inevitable, since obviously being in the single market implied freedom of movement. And that wasn't something, as far as she was concerned, that the British people had voted for in the referendum. So, I think we were bound to leave the single market as a result of that. And then I think she was persuaded that if we were going to leave the single market, we had to leave the customs union as well. And therefore, any kind of soft Brexit was impossible. And you could also perhaps point to the influence of some of her advisors. Nick Timothy would be the obvious one, who now, of course, is a Conservative MP. So it's not to say she was captured by them, but I think she was influenced by her obsession, if you like, with getting immigration down. And then really, she was, as very much a kind of tribal Tory, just desperate to hold the party together. And also, that meant, as a tribal Tory, that she couldn't possibly do a deal with the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats to get a softer Brexit through.
Labour overread the 2017 election result as a sign that they could win next time. And it's been so debated, this. It's still puzzling given Corbyn's personal unpopularity. When writing about it, like, how do you explain what happened there, which was, of course, reversed at the next one?
Well, I mean, I think people were fairly unhappy with the way that the Conservatives had run the country between 2010 and 2015, actually, and with austerity. But they weren't convinced by Ed Miliband in 2015. And of course, many people who had voted Liberal Democrat were alienated as well. So I think when Theresa May took over, the Conservatives weren't in as good a place as perhaps some people thought they were anyway. And I think it is the case that Jeremy Corbyn was able to bring in some people who previously had not bothered voting, or certainly not bothered voting for Labour. I think there was also a degree of suspicion as to why Theresa May had called the election early when she suggested that she wasn't going to. And you also have to point to the Tory campaign. I mean, it was very, very disorganised. It wasn't clear who was in charge. She was a terrible campaigner for all her other merits. And I think it was just everything that could go wrong went wrong. And in some senses, it was the kind of perfect storm. And for Labour, as the only viable alternative, because so many people weren't going to vote Liberal Democrat at that point, the Greens weren't really in with a shout either at that point. You put all that together and you get Labour at something like 40-odd%.
Conversely, I mean, Johnson massively overinterpreted what he called his stonking mandate in 2019. But it wasn't just him. The media consensus was like, the Johnson decade lies ahead. I mean, obviously COVID happened, and it's very hard to imagine what would have happened without a pandemic. But do you think that it was, even on the day, sort of overinterpreted as hegemony, here we come?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, I think from helping to write the book on the 2019 election, it was very much a kind of contingent event. It was about Brexit. It was about Boris in terms of his personality, and it was also about Corbyn, who by that time obviously had alienated a lot of people, particularly with his stance over the Skripal poisoning. And obviously some of the problems he was having keeping Labour MPs in line as well. And I think you're absolutely right. Many on the right, particularly in the Conservative Party, overinterpreted that result as some great realignment. I mean, they were even referring to it with a definite article, the realignment, partly because obviously they were able to win those red wall seats. And I think they mistook, if you like, a rather contingent result for something much more profound. And that's not to say, obviously, that there was a degree of realignment there, but I just don't think it was quite as profound as
Yeah.
some people suspect.
The other thing I would say about 2019 is there are parallels, I think, with 2024 and the idea of a sandcastle majority, which is you manage to stack up all your votes in the right places and you get a majority that on paper looks really significant. It was 80 for Boris Johnson, even more for Keir Starmer. But the second you start disappointing a small group of people,
Yeah.
it washes away. And the red wall narrative, that was all based on this idea of levelling up. Now, you could say Boris Johnson meant to do all of that and then COVID got in the way. You could say that he never had a plan at all and it was all very cynical. Either way, a lot of those seats were won by promising things that it was always going to be very, very difficult for any government to deliver, let alone a Conservative government that was also trying to bring its coalition together and maintain its coalition elsewhere. So to go back to what we were talking about right at the very beginning, I think the thing you see with first past the post is you can get big majorities on smaller vote shares that prove very unstable.
And also relatively small promises. So, 2 or 3 things that really captured the imagination.
Yeah, and then if you don't do those 2 or 3 things, you're fucked.
Yeah.
Well, the Tories have had some good ideas.
Can I say that? Is that all right?
I mean, what podcast do you think you're on? Say it again. The Tories did have some good ideas, like including levelling up and net zero. There were various things, but they all seem to, and Tim's book reminds me of this, they just sort of fell away, or they were rejected completely by later leaders who went, "That's not my policy." Like, why did all of their good ideas end up sort of dying on the vine?
I think it's largely because they became attached to certain individuals, these leaders who then wanted to kind of do these refreshes and these rebrands in their own image, and they didn't want to be tied up. And we talked about this kind of entertainment industry around the right wing that exists on the broadcast news and social media in particular. And so these policies like levelling up and net zero became very much Boris policies. So when the world, well, Britain, but obviously even more broadly, some of the world fell out of love with Boris Johnson post-COVID, anything that was deeply attached to him couldn't go on. And I think Sunak kind of had the same issue. This wasn't a good idea, in my view, but with Stop the Boats, that very much became all about him. And so these policies disappear with those leaders. Interestingly, also, on levelling up particularly, and net zero, Labour obviously did pick those up and use slightly different terminology around them. So then they became Labour policies. So then they can't be seen to be associated because you end up with the questions on GB News and so on that reinforce that, those difficult entertainment moments.
They're also hard to do, right?
Well, levelling up particularly.
And net zero is also hard to do if you can't put the investment in it, and it takes time. So I think it's one of those things that can be a really catchy slogan, and then when you start looking at it and going, this is how much money we need, but also if you want to do levelling up, say we're going to have to get real about planning and upset a lot of our own MPs who are in seats where this railway or this housing development is going to be built, and it gets put in the too difficult category.
I mean, it's easy to forget, though, that back in the midst of time now, there were sensible people like Nick Bowles who were doing really interesting things around like cities and planning and all of that. And then they disappeared. So, Tim, I'm interested to ask, Bowles in particular, there's a quote here that's really interesting from him. In 2019, he said, "The hard right has taken over the Conservative Party. The Brexit Party has won the war without electing a single MP. Boris Johnson isn't our new Prime Minister, Nigel Farage is." So he was obviously, he could see what was going on and he spoke about this. What happened to people like him? Why did the centre of the party so deeply collapse?
Well, I mean, I think there's a question as to whether it has collapsed or just stayed silent. I mean, I think one of the weird things about the parliamentary party is that possibly there is a kind of silent centrist majority there, but it's just not very well organised and not very vocal. And
God forbid it should ever actually get what it wants.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the impression, if you like, of the Conservative Party is perhaps it's drifted as a whole, perhaps further to the populist radical right than in fact might be the case were those MPs to organise themselves and get together and resist what's gone on. But the fact is that they didn't, either because they were afraid perhaps of the media or because they were afraid of their own grassroots, or because they committed to Boris Johnson and thought, we've elected Boris Johnson now, and we have to stick with it. But I mean, coming back to this point about why the Conservatives couldn't do some of the policies that they wanted to do, is basically down to the fact that, at heart, this is still a bog standard Thatcherite party. I mean, it doesn't believe in spending very much money, and it wants to keep taxes as low as possible. And if you are at heart committed to that kind of politics, then quite frankly, you aren't going to invest enough in the NHS. You aren't going to invest enough in regional policy. It's just a complete mismatch, if you like, between what you promised in your manifesto, or what you've allowed Boris Johnson to pretend that he's promised in the manifesto, and what your MPs are actually prepared to do, and indeed what your grassroots are prepared to stomach as well.
What is the future for them now, though? Because obviously there's been the expulsions, the election losses, and quite a lot of younger MPs, simply deciding that they're not interested. Have they got a talent problem now? What's their future?
Well, they've certainly got a talent pool problem in Parliament. If you've only got 121 MPs, once you exclude the mad and the bad, you aren't down to many people who can, do a great job for you. I mean, I think there probably won't be any shortage of people wanting to become Tory MPs. And indeed, in some ways, if you're looking to become a Tory MP, people listening to this podcast, perhaps even, now's not a bad time to get in. The kind of bottom of the market. There's always
Always room.
A good point to join. Exactly. As to the future, that is a biggie. I think that does come back to whether this transformation that I've talked about is permanent, and that they're not actually going to be able to pull back, or whether there is still some hope that they come to their senses. And if you look back at the history of the Conservative Party, very often it has pulled itself together, realised that to some extent it has to compromise with the electorate, and change direction. David Cameron was a good example of that, even though to some extent that change of direction proved to be superficial, because of course once they got into power in 2010, they acted like the bog standard Thatcherites that they actually were. So I wouldn't give up all hope, I think, if I were a more centrist mainstream Conservative. It may take one or two more elections for them to realise this. But, coming back to something that you've all talked about, of course, that does presume to some extent that we are now, living in fairly predictable times. Whereas, of course, if what we're seeing, this fragmentation of the party system, is the new normal, then it's going to be much, much more difficult, I think, for the Conservative Party to get things back on track.
Rachel, one Tory rebel said in 2019, it's one of my favourite quotes in the book, I think, "The party is now led by a narrow sect who wouldn't be out of place in a Muppet vertion of The Handmaid's Tale." But is it really narrow if Kemi Badenoch is the leader? I take Tim's point that actually there might be quite a lot of centrists who just don't want to say anything. But I'm wondering, how strong is the Muppet Handmaid's Tale command over the party?
Can I just say that I really want to know who that is?
I
I know Tim won't tell us, but maybe we'll turn the microphones off at the end and you can tell us who that was.
I just wish I'd done the cover of the book differently. Now
I think it's kind of more fundamental than that. I think that the Conservative Party kind of has to decide what it is, and there is space in British politics for a centre-right. Broadly, we focus on being fiscally responsible, kind of Cameroon and some people who abandoned it for the Lib Dems style party that would leave space on the right wing for an insurgent right party like UKIP, like Reform, whatever. There is also a route that takes it down, kind of chasing the Reform vote, which comes with lots of risks, because as one Tory insider told me, if you're trying to be Reform light, why wouldn't voters just go for the full fat version? But there is a route there that says we have to unite the right. They're just fundamentally different, and I don't think the Conservative Party can hope to recover until it decides which route it's going to take. And Kemi Badenoch is ignoring the fact that that is a fundamental decision that she's going to have to make.
Tim, finally, I mean, it is a massive, it's like an anthology of failures. And like you said, nothing there should be that surprising to Conservative readers. But you certainly don't get the message. The only thing they seem to have failed in doing is being too left-wing. That seems to be the conclusion. Do you think that they if they haven't done that had that reckoning yet, do you think that they're going to have a reckoning with all the things that went wrong?
Well, I think they missed an opportunity in the leadership contest. I mean, I think that was very much a kind of comfort zone contest, I'm afraid. None of the candidates really addressed, what had gone wrong. And Kemi Badenoch, who won it, still doesn't. It's notable when she's asked in interviews, or what did the government get wrong? She comes out with a mantra. Well, we talked right, but we governed left. I mean, on what planet do people think that the last Conservative government, was a left-wing government? I mean, who knows? She doesn't talk, and the candidates for that leadership contest didn't talk about, the complete meltdown of some public services, and in particular the NHS. They didn't really talk about, the way they presided over kind of years of stagnant real wages.
Yeah.
For them, it was all about, the fact that they didn't make enough tax cuts, and they didn't do enough to sort out immigration. Now, clearly immigration was a problem for many voters, but actually the NHS and the state of the economy were really very, very important. But you didn't hear very much about that. So I strongly suspect that they might need to lose another election or two, or indeed, they might need to be overtaken by Reform UK before they make the decision, as Rachel suggested, to move towards being, a more, if you like, conventional centre-right party. But the problem, I just, one thing I would say, the problem for the Conservative Party has for a long time been that they have a rival on their right, which anyway, until now, has been capable of winning votes, but not actually that capable of winning seats. And as a result of that, and it's a function of the first past the post system, that is a real problem for them. They haven't really got an obvious coalition partner in Parliament until now. I mean, perhaps if Reform can win seats as well as votes, then the Conservative Party could come back into power in some kind of coalition with Reform. That would be in some ways quite unusual as a result of the first past the post system. It's something we normally see in PR systems, but it's a feasible future.
I prefer the lose two elections first scenario.